The silence in Eleanor Vance's New York apartment was so profound it almost felt like an entity of its own, an echo of the emptiness she felt inside. At 38, Eleanor led a life that too many would appear successful. A brilliant data analyst at a cutting-edge tech corporation, a spacious Upper West Side apartment, and an enviable network of professional contacts. Yet beneath the facade of competence and control, Eleanor was a prisoner of fear. This fear wasn't the sudden panic of an emergency, nor the anticipated apprehension of a grand event. It was an insidious, constant dread, a fog that seeped into every crevice of her existence, paralyzing her and preventing her from living fully, manifested in 1,000 subtle ways. The fear of public speaking, which kept her from accepting promotions requiring more visibility. The fear of emotional exposure, which trapped her in superficial, empty relationships. The fear of failure, which paralyzed her in the face of new opportunities. And, perhaps most cruelly, the fear of judgment, which led her to live a controlled, risk-averse life. Eleanor's main problem, which had lingered for over a decade, was a painful stagnation and an inability to reach her true potential. She felt trapped in a secure but suffocating routine. Her career, though successful, didn't satisfy her. She yearned for more challenging projects, to lead teams, to innovate. But the fear of failing or making a mistake kept her in her data analyst role, where precision and predictability were her best friends. There was a leadership vacancy at Horizon Tech, her company, a position she secretly coveted and was qualified for. But the selection process demanded a public presentation and a series of interviews with the board. Each time the opportunity arose, Eleanor found an excuse not to apply. Or, when she did under pressure, sabotaged herself at the crucial moment. Her apartment, though elegant, mirrored her life, overly organized, impeccable, almost lifeless. There were no personal photos on display, just technical books and abstract art pieces. The refrigerator was always stocked with practical essentials, and never ingredients for a spontaneous meal or a dinner with friends. She exercised methodically at the building's gym, but avoided group classes, preferring the safety of her own bubble. Even her clothes were chosen for their discretion and ability to blend in, never to stand out. The few friends she had were colleagues or superficial acquaintances from social events. She was the good listener, the person who was always there but never revealed much of herself. Her romantic relationships were short and unfulfilling, usually ending because she refused to take the next step, to move closer, to plan a future. Her younger sister Sarah's wedding, a few months away, was a source of veiled anxiety. Sarah, with her spontaneity and openness, was everything Eleanor couldn't bring herself to be. The invitation to be a bridesmaid and the responsibility of giving a speech terrified her. Eleanor's fear had intensified most after an incident years ago, a crucial project presentation early in her career, where a lapse in memory caused her to stutter and get lost amidst an audience of executives. The cold sweat, the flush in her face, the looks of disappointment, that memory became ingrained in her mind like a trauma. From that day on, she swore to herself she would never again expose herself to such humiliation. Fortress around herself, a barrier against judgment and potential failure. But this fortress became her prison. Her boss, the director of data analytics, David Chen, was a patient but pragmatic man. He saw Eleanor's potential, but also her reticence. "Eleanor," he once said, with a hint of veiled frustration, "you have the mind for it, but you lack drive. You have to want more." Eleanor merely smiled politely and changed the subject, her fear of taking risks outweighing any real ambition. She believed being safe was better than risking and possibly failing. In truth, Eleanor had a bigger secret. She was an amateur science fiction writer with an undeniable talent for crafting complex worlds and fascinating characters. Her manuscripts, saved in an encrypted file on her computer, were her sanctuary, the only place where she allowed herself to be truly creative and bold. She dreamed of publishing, of seeing her books on shelves, but the fear of rejection, criticism, and public scrutiny prevented her from even considering submitting her work to a publisher. The irony was brutal. her greatest passion, the only thing that could truly fulfill her, was also the most tightly guarded by her fear. She was living a half-life, and the consequences of this paralysis were beginning to weigh unbearably. Eleanor's world, though vast in theoretical possibilities, was a sphere rigidly controlled by her own self-imposed limits. She lived in a constant hum of what-ifs, each potential scenario painted with a brush of disaster. Her Upper West Side apartment, a symbol of her financial stability, was also a reflection of her stagnation. The books on her shelves, all about data analysis, economics, or generic self-help, served as an intellectual armor, defending her from the vulnerability, a fiction, and the art that truly moved her. The only exception was a small, hidden bookshelf, filled with science fiction classics, the only titles that allowed her to dream, but which were kept a secret. At work, Horizon Tech was a colossus of innovation, yet Eleanor existed on its periphery, an essential but discreet cog. She was the queen of data, the go-to person for impeccable analyses, but always behind the scenes. Her desk was the most organized on the floor, every pen aligned, every document in its proper place. It's a microcosm of her desire for control in a chaotic universe. David Chen, her boss, embodied the opportunity she stubbornly refused to seize. He was a mentor who saw beyond her current performance, but his patience was wearing thin. David was not a man of half measures. His deep, direct voice was a constant reminder of what Eleanor could be. "Eleanor, the world doesn't wait for perfection. It waits for action," he often said. Advice she filed away in her subconscious but rarely applied. The relationship with her sister. Sarah was one of the most sensitive points. Sarah, 3 years younger, was Eleanor's polar opposite, outgoing, spontaneous. A social butterfly who embraced experiences without hesitation. She was the personification of the full life that Eleanor secretly envied, but that her fear prevented her from attaining. Sarah's wedding, now approaching, was a bittersweet event. Eleanor loved her sister, but every detail of the celebration, the planning with the bridesmaids, the dress fitting, Sarah's simple, carefree joy, accentuated the chasm between them. The thought of giving the bridesmaid's speech filled her with icy dread. She practiced in front of the mirror, her words caught in her throat, the image of her past failure looming over her. The primary manifestation of Eleanor's fear was analysis paralysis. She analyzed every decision to exhaustion, forecasting all possible negative scenarios and invariably chose inaction. This paralysis wasn't just mental, it was physical. Opportunities to advance her career or deepen a relationship simply withered because she couldn't take the first step. She was a brilliant strategist in theory, but a coward in practice. This inaction had led to the loss of her most promising relationship with Mark, charming architect Eleanor genuinely liked. Mark was patient, but grew tired of her reluctance to commit, to plan trips, to simply be. He saw the potential in her, but also the invisible barrier she erected. "You're like a fascinating book, Eleanor," he said upon their farewell, but with the pages glued together. The metaphor hit her, but the fear of being rejected again, or of giving her heart to someone who might hurt her, was greater than the pain of loss. The vibrant, dynamic outer world of New York was a stark contrast to her inner life. The yellow cabs, the ceaseless crowds in Times Square, city's nonstop energy, all represented the risk and vitality that Eleanor avoided. She retreated into her routine, her algorithms, and her secret science fiction stories, where she controlled every variable. Her world was a safe simulation, where fear couldn't intrude, but at a tremendous cost, that of never truly living. The fortress she had built was robust, but the air inside was growing thin, and the next breath of life could be fatal to her illusion of security. The invisible wall Eleanor had built around herself, made of fear and inaction, began to crumble into visible pieces. The problem of stagnation, once an annoying whisper in her mind, transformed into a dull roar that echoed in every aspect of her life. At work, the coveted leadership position at Horizon Tech, which she had hesitated to truly apply for, was filled by a less experienced but more assertive colleague. Sarah, her sister, was the first to deliver the news with a thinly disguised look of pity. "Eleanor, they gave the position to Michael. He doesn't even have half your expertise, but he's assertive, you know." The truth was a punch to the gut. Eleanor's fear of exposure, of shining, had cost her a unique opportunity. She forced a smile, but the humiliation burned. Losing the promotion wasn't just a blow to her ambition, it was a trigger. The chronic headaches she had previously ignored became more frequent and severe. Her insomnia worsened. Her nights were filled with anxious thoughts and regrets. The comfort of her routine became a suffocating prison. She avoided the company cafeteria, the hallways where she might encounter Michael, preferring to eat lunch alone at her desk, staring at the numbers on her screen as if they could shield her from reality. The pressure for Sarah's wedding mounted. The date was fast approaching, and with it, the inevitable responsibility of the bridesmaid's speech. Eleanor spent hours in her bathroom, practicing in front of the mirror. The words, which seemed so clear on paper, turned into a tangled mess of sounds in her throat. She visualized the audience, their judgmental stares, the muffled laughter. Cold sweat trickled down her back, her heart pounded. She tried several times to ask Sarah to replace her, inventing flimsy excuses about work pressure and lack of time, but Sarah, exasperated, replied, "Eleanor, it's my wedding. I can't believe you're doing this again. You never take a risk with anything." The pain in Sarah's voice was palpable, but Eleanor's fear was greater than the pain of hurting her sister. David Chen, her boss, who had encouraged her for so long, began to lose patience. After the promotion loss, he called her into a meeting. "Eleanor, I need to be frank. Your analytical work is impeccable, but your reluctance to take on a more visible role is becoming a problem for the team. You have the talent, but you don't use it. You hide." Eleanor, on the defensive, tried to explain her work method, her preference for behind-the-scenes efficiency. David interrupted her. "It's not about method, Eleanor. It's about fear. The fear of failure, the fear of standing out, it's holding you back from growing, and, frankly, it's starting to prevent me from relying on you for more strategic roles." It was the first time someone had so directly verbalized the root of her problem, the worst consequence of her fear. However, came from her secret refuge, writing. Inspired by her pain and isolation, Eleanor had begun writing a new novel, her most ambitious work yet, a dystopian science fiction story about a society paralyzed by fear. It was cathartic. She spent nights writing, immersed in her imaginary world. Finally, after months of hard work, the manuscript was ready. But the fear of rejection was overwhelming. She read and reread it, finding flaws, imagining criticisms. The idea of sending it to a publisher, of exposing herself to public judgment, was an even greater terror than public speaking. A college friend, Clara, a literary agent Eleanor had avoided for years because of this secret, found her at a coffee shop. Clara, excited, talked about a new publisher looking for fresh voices in science fiction. "Eleanor, you've always been so creative. Have you ever thought about writing a book?" Eleanor's heart turned cold. She quickly made up an excuse about too much work and lack of inspiration. Clara, perceptive, noticed her hesitation. "Well, if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. The opportunity of a lifetime, her cherished dream, is right there, within her reach," but Eleanor's fear made her push it away. The manuscript, her heart on paper, remained locked on her computer. The paralysis by fear was eating Eleanor alive. She saw herself in a dead end, caught between the desire for a full life and the terror of taking risks. Professional and personal dissatisfaction mingled into a bitter cocktail of regret. The lines on her face, once smooth, showed signs of stress. She felt cornered by her own choices, by the fear that kept her from breathing. Sarah's wedding was fast approaching, and the image of herself on stage, frozen, was a recurring nightmare. The climax of her suffering lurked, and the fortress of fear she had built was about to become a dead-end cell. As Eleanor struggled in her prison of fear, the world around her continued to spin, weaving subplots that, though seemingly independent, were intrinsically linked to her paralysis. These parallel stories indirectly forced her to confront the paths she refused to take, adding layers to her existential crisis. The first subplot centered on Michael, the colleague who had secured the promotion Eleanor so deeply desired. Michael wasn't a data genius like her, but he possessed a quality Eleanor lacked: the ability to connect and inspire. He began implementing new work methodologies with the team, focusing on collaboration and open idea exchange, a stark contrast to Eleanor's methodical isolation. He organized brainstorming sessions and weekly presentations where everyone was encouraged to speak, even if it meant making mistakes. Eleanor, forced to participate in these meetings, felt like a fish out of water. She watched Michael lead, with his ease and charisma, and realized he wasn't afraid to make mistakes in public, to laugh at himself. This subplot revealed to Eleanor what she was losing, not for lack of talent, but for lack of courage to expose herself and lead. A second subplot unfolded with Sarah and her fiancé, Alex. With the wedding approaching, Sarah was immersed in the final details, but Eleanor's emotional absence weighed heavily. Alex, a calm and observant man, noticed the tension between the sisters. He had tried to connect with Eleanor on several occasions, sensing the barrier she imposed. In a conversation with Sarah, he expressed his concern. "Your sister seems to be carrying a huge weight, Sarah. She isolates herself. Don't you think she needs help?" Sarah, though frustrated by Eleanor's reluctance to fully participate, defended her sister, but Alex's words planted a seed of deeper concern. This subplot explored the impact of Eleanor's fear on her closest relationships, and how her passivity was affecting those who loved her, showing Sarah the need to be more proactive. In helping Eleanor, the most unexpected subplot came from Clara, the literary agent. Ignoring Eleanor's evasion at the coffee shop, Clara, with her sharp intuition, decided to investigate Eleanor's creative past a little further. She recalled drafts of science fiction short stories Eleanor wrote in college, small flashes of a talent she believed had been buried. Clara began to scout out publishers and editors for the type of science fiction they were looking for. She didn't know Eleanor had written a full novel, but she sensed there was something there, an untapped potential. This subplot introduced an element of external destiny or opportunity approaching Eleanor. Regardless of her inaction, which would eventually force her fear to a test of fire, Clara represented the door opening, even if Eleanor refused to see it. Finally, an additional complexity arose in David Chen's own dynamic. Although pragmatic, David had a personal history of overcoming a severe communication problem early in his own career. He saw an echo of his former self in Eleanor, brilliant but paralyzed by insecurity. He subtly began to test Eleanor, giving her tasks that required a little more interaction, or asking for her opinion in larger meetings. His intention was not to punish, but to push, hoping Eleanor could finally break through her own barriers. He was willing to give her one last chance, but time was running out. Each of these subplots, with their own rhythms and developments, was creating an environment of increasing pressure around Eleanor. Michael shone in her place, Sarah suffered. From her detachment, Clara approached her most guarded secret, and David pushed her to the limit. Eleanor's life, once so controlled by her fear, was becoming a cauldron of opportunities and dangers that she could no longer ignore. Fear had been her guardian, but now it was her jailer, and the key to freedom lay in what she feared most. The catalyst for Eleanor's much-needed change didn't come from a major professional catastrophe, but from a sequence of events that forced her to face the abyss her fear had dug. The first alarming sign was the phone call from Sarah. "Eleanor, I can't take it anymore." Sarah's voice was thick with tears. "Alex, he's worried about us, about the wedding. He thinks you despise me, or that I'm not important to you because of your detachment." I tried to explain, but if you can't truly be present for me, maybe you shouldn't be my bridesmaid. I need someone who's 100% with me on that day. Sarah's words hit Eleanor like a lightning bolt. It wasn't about the speech. It was about the pain her fear was causing. She had always imagined her isolation protected her, but it was hurting the people she loved most. The image of Sarah, so spontaneous and full of life, being wounded by her own sister was a painful shock. The fortress of fear trembled. She felt a sharp pang of panic, but also a chilling clarity. She was losing Sarah, the next day at work. The final confrontation with David Chen occurred, and David called her into his office, not with his usual patience, but with a seriousness that made her freeze. "Eleanor, I just got a call from HR. They're observing your performance in meetings. and your effectiveness in tasks requiring leadership and interaction. They're considering relocating you to a department where interaction is minimal. It's a dead end for your career here. I fought for you, Eleanor, but I can't anymore. You need to do something drastic. I know you're afraid. I see it. But fear is destroying you. The word fear resonated, echoing Sarah's words, Mark's, and even her own conscience. It was no longer an assumption, but a direct accusation. The risk of being relocated to a dead-end role was the final blow to the illusion of security she had built. Her controlled world was crumbling. Eleanor left David's office like an automaton. She walked through the streets of New York. The crowd, around her a blur. She felt suffocated, not by the air, but by the fear that enveloped her. That's when her phone vibrated. A message from Clara. Eleanor, something just clicked. Those sci-fi stories you wrote in college, they were amazing. If you have anything lying around, even a draft, send it to me. There's a new publisher, desperate. For that kind of voice, it's a golden opportunity. Clara's message, which Eleanor would have dismissed another time, became a catalyst. She was about to lose her career, had already hurt her sister, and now, the one thing that made her feel alive, her secret writing, was being called into the light by someone who believed in her. The manuscript on her computer wasn't just a secret, it was the essence of her soul, the testament to her courage in a world she dared not face. The fear of sending the book to a publisher, of facing public rejection, was colossal. But the fear of not living, of not trying, becoming a diminished version of herself, of losing everything that mattered, was even greater. Eleanor arrived. At her apartment, silence now felt more like an invitation than a prison. She opened her computer, her fingers trembling. She navigated to the encrypted folder, her heart pounding in her chest. The novel's file, Echoes of the Undaunted, was there. She reread the first few pages, not with her usual self-criticism, but with a sense of urgency. It was good, it was hers, and it was terrifying. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. It's not from anxious insomnia, but from a fever of decision. She spent the final hours revising, editing, and finally wrote an email to Clara. Her hands sweated as she attached the file. It was a leap into the dark. Clara, she wrote, I have something. It's a novel. Echoes of the Undaunted. Be honest. Please, don't judge me. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the send button. Every fiber of her being screamed at her not to do it, to retreat to the safety of her cocoon. But Sarah's voice, David's disappointment, Clara's opportunity, and the weight of her own stagnation united in a powerful chorus. With one last breath, she clicked. The mouse click resonated in the apartment's silence like thunder. There was no turning back. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but for the first time in years, Eleanor had acted despite it. It wasn't a total victory, but it was the first step, the first crack in the wall of her fortress. She had thrown herself into the unknown, and the vertigo was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The turning point had arrived in Eleanor's journey. From a prisoner of fear to a woman in search of her freedom finally began. The click of the mouse that sent Eleanor's manuscript to Clara echoed in an eerie silence. But it wasn't long before the first waves of its consequences began to propagate. The vertigo of action, initially liberating, gave way to suffocating anxiety. Eleanor spent the following hours alternating between the euphoria of having broken through her own barrier and the panic of potential rejection. Doubt gnawed at her. Was her book good enough? Would she be ridiculed for her audacity? Fear her old companion fought to regain control. The first reaction came from Clara, an hour after the submission. Eleanor's phone rang. It was Clara, and her voice, usually ebullient, was now more subdued, almost reverent. Eleanor, I don't know what to say. It's simply brilliant. I started reading and couldn't stop. It's exactly what publishers are looking for. It raw talent, a unique voice. The avalanche of praise was almost as terrifying as criticism. Eleanor had expected a no, a failure. The acceptance and enthusiasm caught her off guard. Clara's joy was contagious, But deep down, Eleanor felt the fear that this euphoria was just an illusion. Success was as unknown a territory as failure. The impact of Sarah's letter and of David Chin's warning forced Eleanor into more direct action. With Clara's initial validation still echoing in her mind, she felt compelled to confront the next challenge. Sarah. She called her sister, and this time her voice was firm. Sarah, I know I hurt you. You're absolutely right. I'm afraid. Afraid of being who I really am. Afraid of disappointing. Afraid of everything. But I want to change. I need to change. For you. For me. Please, give me another chance too. Be your bridesmaid. I promise I'll be there. Truly. Sarah, surprised by Eleanor's frankness, hesitated. She had known her sister too long to trust empty promises. Eleanor, I want to believe you, but I've been hurt too much. Do you really want this? It's not just for me, it's for you. The silence on the other end of the line was filled with expectation. Eleanor took a deep breath. It's for me too. Sarah, and for you, I'll prove it to you. Sarah agreed to give her one last chance, but with a condition. I'm scheduling lunch. The three of us, me and Alex, and you're going to talk for real. It was a small but monumental step at work. The atmosphere was still tense. Michael, the new leader, acted with a mix of respect and distance. Eleanor tried to integrate into the new methodologies he had implemented, but the brainstorming sessions, which demanded active participation, were still a challenge. She struggled to speak, but the words seemed stuck. David Chen observed her from afar, with a look Eleanor couldn't decipher. Is it disappointment or a faint hope? The news of the manuscript, however, began to spread subtly. Clara, excited, had already made some initial contacts with publishers, and the buzz of a promising new talent in science fiction began to circulate in literary circles. Eleanor received an email from Clara with feedback from a publisher. Incredible. Potential, distinct voice. We need a meeting. The fear which seemed to have subsided with the book's submission returned with full force. A meeting meant exposure, talking about the story, defending her art. It was a direct confrontation with the dread of criticism and judgment she so deeply avoided. This first wave of consequences and reactions was a mix of validation and new challenges. The initial acceptance of her work brought a glimmer of hope, but also pushed her out of her comfort zone. The promise of reconnection with Sarah and the impending meeting with Alex were tests of her newfound willingness to open up. The pressure at work, now more evident, demanded a change in behavior she hadn't yet mastered. Eleanor stood on the threshold of a new phase, where inaction was no longer an option. She had cast the die, and now she had to face the consequences, both the promising and the terrifying. The true fight against her fear was just beginning, and she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The lunch with Sarah and Alex was Eleanor's first battlefield in her personal war against fear. She arrived at the restaurant with a knot in her stomach, but this time, she didn't allow anxiety to paralyze her. She sat at the table, took a deep breath, and before Sarah or Alex could start the conversation, she began to speak. I know it hasn't been easy for you too. I'm so sorry. I've been battling a very big fear, a fear of connecting, of being vulnerable, of showing who I really am, and that has stopped me from living and from being present for the people I love. Her voice trembled, but she continued, looking into Sarah's and Alex's eyes. I love you both, and I desperately want to be the sister and friend you deserve. I'm working on it. Eleanor's confession, her raw honesty, shocked Sarah and Alex. Sarah, with teary eyes, reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand. I love you, Eleanor, and I'm glad you're saying this. It hasn't been easy for us either. Alex, in his calm voice, added, It takes a lot of courage to admit that, Eleanor. We're here for you. That lunch marked the beginning of a new phase in the sisters' relationship, a phase built on truth and vulnerability. Eleanor felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. The first breeze of freedom, with Sarah's encouragement and Clara's initial acceptance of her manuscript. Eleanor channeled her energy into preparing for the publisher meeting. She met virtually with Clara several times rehearsing how to present echoes of the undaunted. Clara encouraged her to speak passionately about her world and characters, to defend her vision. Don't hide behind the details, Eleanor. Show them the soul of your story. Eleanor practiced countless times in front of the mirror, no longer with the terror of failure, but with the determination to tell her truth. She read articles on dealing with nervousness, breathing techniques, and even the power of body language. It was a case study in how to apply her analytical skills to overcome an emotional problem at work. Eleanor began to apply the lessons she was learning in her personal life. In the brainstorming sessions led by Michael, she started forcing herself to contribute ideas. At first, the words came out with difficulty, her voice low, but with each small contribution, her confidence grew. She asked questions, offered insights, and, to her surprise, Michael and the team valued her contributions. David Chen, observing from afar, noticed the subtle change in Eleanor. He saw her trying, taking risks, and an almost imperceptible smile crossed his face. Therapy also became a fundamental pillar in her journey. Eleanor began weekly sessions with a therapist recommended by Clara, a specialist in anxiety disorders and social phobia. The sessions were a safe space where Eleanor could explore the root of her fears, relive the trauma of that early career presentation, and deconstruct the thought patterns that kept her paralyzed. She learned to identify her triggers, practice grounding techniques, and confront her irrational thoughts. Fear doesn't disappear, Eleanor, the therapist said. It becomes a passenger in the back seat. You decide where to drive. For the first time in years, Eleanor truly began to take care of herself, not just physically, but emotionally. She resumed hobbies she had abandoned for fear of being judged, like drawing. She started going out with Sarah for coffee, allowing herself to be spontaneous, something she would have avoided at all costs before. Small steps, but giants, for someone who had lived so long imprisoned. Eleanor's journey of overcoming was an ongoing process. There were days when fear almost overwhelmed her again, days when the urge to retreat to her comfort zone was overwhelming. But the support of Sarah and Alex, Clara's optimism, David Chen's new attitude, and, above all, the burning desire to publish her book and live the life she deserved propelled her forward. She was learning to embrace uncertainty, to celebrate small victories, and to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite it. The fortress was crumbling, not into ruins, but into a path to freedom. With the publisher meeting and Sarah's wedding dangerously approaching, Eleanor felt an overwhelming mix of panic and a strange sense of purpose. Her journey of overcoming, though still full of stumbles, had given her a new perspective. Fear was no longer a wall, but an obstacle to be overcome. She was preparing for her two biggest challenges. The first major test would be the meeting with the publisher. Clara, her literary agent, arranged the encounter at an elegant office in Midtown Manhattan. Eleanor spent hours revising the manuscript, practicing her presentation, and visualizing every possible question. Her therapist, Dr. Evelyn, read a name Eleanor finally allowed herself to retain. It helped her create anchors, breathing, and visualization techniques that would keep her present and calm, even under pressure. Remember, Eleanor, Dr. Reed advised, fear is trying to protect you from judgment, but your voice needs to be heard. You are the author of your story, literally and metaphorically. The week leading up to the meeting, Eleanor had an unexpected conversation with David Chen. He called her into his office again, but this time his expression was one of genuine concern and an almost pride. Eleanor, I just had a call from HR. They're observing your performance in meetings and your effectiveness in tasks requiring leadership and interaction. They're still considering relocating you to a department where interaction is minimal. It's a dead end for your career here. I've fought for you, Eleanor, but I can't anymore. You need to do something drastic. I know you're afraid. I see it. But fear is destroying you. The pressure was immense. But instead of shrinking, Eleanor felt a determination grow. I'm going to show myself, David. I'm going to show that I'm ready to lead, to innovate. Not because I'm afraid of being relocated, but because I finally want this. David nodded, a small smile on his lips. He knew Eleanor's final test at Horizon Tech was just beginning. The other ordeal was the speech at Sarah's wedding. Eleanor had continued to practice, but the words still felt stuck. In a moment of panic, she thought about writing something more generic, less personal, to avoid vulnerability. It was Sarah who stopped her. During a final bridesmaid dress fitting, Sarah noticed Eleanor's paleness. "Hey, what's going on?" Eleanor confessed her fears about the speech, the pressure to be perfect. Sarah hugged her. "Eleanor, I don't want a perfect speech. I want you to speak from your heart. I want you, the real Eleanor." Sarah's unconditional acceptance was balm for her soul. Eleanor decided her speech wouldn't be about perfection, but about truth and overcoming. Meanwhile, Clara's subplot intensified. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, Clara had already sent the manuscript to 2 more publishers, sensing the potential was too great to limit to a single offer. She was confident, but also apprehensive about Eleanor's reaction if things started moving quickly. Clara represented the external force pushing Eleanor into the light. Whether she was ready or not, the days before the publisher meeting and the wedding were an emotional roller coaster. Eleanor used her grounding techniques, wrote in her journal about her fears and hopes, and allowed herself to feel her emotions instead of suppressing them. She even revisited some of her old drawings, finding comfort in the artistic expression she had abandoned. She was preparing not to be perfect, but to be genuine. The stage was set. The publisher meeting was the next morning, and Sarah's wedding in a few days. Eleanor felt the fear, the old familiar sensation, but now, instead of submitting to it, she used it as fuel. She was no longer running. She was moving forward, step by step, towards her greatest challenges. The climax was approaching, and Eleanor knew her courage would be tested like never before. The decision to click send had only been the first step. Now it was time to face the doors that had opened and the demons that awaited her on the other side. The day of the publisher meeting dawned under a gray New York sky, a reflection of the knot in Eleanor's stomach. Eleanor put on a blazer that made her feel powerful, but her hands trembled as she pinned her hair up. Dr. Reed had taught her a technique, to imagine a shield of strength, not of fear, but of courage. In the taxi, she closed her eyes and recited her anchor, "I am the author of my story. My voice matters." Upon arriving at the publisher's office, the luxury and formality of the environment were intimidating. Clara was waiting for her, an encouraging smile on her face. Inside the meeting room, 3 high-ranking editors waited, their gazes serious and analytical. Eleanor felt fear rise in her throat, the same panic from that traumatic presentation years ago. Her heart pounded and cold sweat began to trickle down. Clara started, "Introducing Eleanor and the concept of echoes of the undaunted." Then it was Eleanor's turn. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words got stuck. The image of past failure flickered in her mind. She felt the flush on her face, the imminence of disaster. But this time, something was different. She didn't shrink back. Instead, she took a deep breath, remembered Sarah's words, David Chen's, and her therapist's. She looked at the manuscript in front of her, her heart on paper. "Gentlemen, Eleanor," began, her voice a little hoarse, but gaining strength with each word. "I am Eleanor Vance, and I wrote Echoes of the Undaunted." She paused, fixing her gaze on each editor. This story is about a society paralyzed by fear. It's about the consequences of inaction. It's about the struggle to find the courage to truly live, even when the world seems to drag you into darkness. She continued, not reciting a script, but speaking from the heart. She described the characters, the plot, the underlying message. She didn't shy away from her own experiences with fear, with stagnation. She spoke about the irony of having written a story about courage while she herself was hiding. The passion in her voice was palpable. The editors, previously serious, were now leaning forward, listening intently. They asked questions, and Eleanor, for the first time in a high-stakes environment, answered with confidence, defending her choices, explaining her intentions. She was genuinely present. At the end of the presentation, one of the editors. A woman with a piercing gaze looked at her and said, "Eleanor, your manuscript is captivating. But your passion, your honesty about the story behind the story, that's what convinced us." The editor picked up a contract. "We want to publish Echoes of the Undaunted." Eleanor felt a wave of relief so great it almost made her faint. The fear was still there, but it had been silenced by action, by vulnerability. She had won the first and biggest confrontation. Days later, at Sarah's wedding rehearsal, Eleanor practiced her speech one last time. The words flowed naturally, full of affection and sincerity. Sarah watched her, a genuine, proud smile on her face. On the wedding day, the ceremony was beautiful. When it was time for the bridesmaid's speech, Eleanor walked up to the podium. Thousands of eyes were on her. The fear of failing, of stuttering, of humiliating herself haunted her. But then she saw Sarah smiling, Alex nodding, remembered the publishing contract in her purse, the promise she had made to herself. "Good evening, everyone," Eleanor began, her voice clear and strong without a single tremor. "Too many of you? I'm Eleanor Vance, the data analyst. But to Sarah, I'm the older sister, and today, I'm the happiest bridesmaid in the world." She paused, her eyes welling up. "Sarah, you've always been the courage I didn't have. You throw yourself into life, and that has inspired me. I lived many years in fear of failing, of being judged, of exposing myself. This fear made me miss opportunities, pushed away the people I love, including you," Eleanor continued, without notes, speaking from the heart about her journey, about the manuscript, about her promise to herself to live fully. "Today I'm here not as the perfect sister, but as the sister who is learning to be brave. And I learned that from you, Sarah." No tears streamed down Sarah's face, but they were tears of emotion and relief. "So, I toast to Sarah and Alex." Eleanor raised her glass, her hand steady. "May your lives be a journey of courage, love, and vulnerability. May you never be afraid to be true to each other and to the world. I love you both." Applause filled the hall. People stood up, many with teary eyes. Eleanor felt a lightness she never thought possible. She walked down from the stage, and Sarah hugged her tightly. "You did it, Eleanor. You really did it." That moment, Eleanor knew that fear no longer controlled her. She had spoken her truth, and she had been accepted. She was free. The success of Echoes of the Undaunted was meteoric, driven by its author's story of triumph, the data analyst, who conquered fear to publish her novel, and the undeniable quality of the narrative. The book became a bestseller. Critics acclaimed it, and readers embraced it, feeling a deep connection to the journey of courage and vulnerability of its characters, which for many was a reflection of Eleanor herself. She did interviews, attended book fairs, and while initial nervousness never completely vanished, she learned to manage it. The fear of being judged had been replaced by the gratitude of being heard. Her relationship with Sarah blossomed. Honest Lunch was the first of many. Eleanor became a constant and genuine presence in her sister's life. She helped with wedding planning with enthusiasm, not out of obligation, but out of love. On the big day, Eleanor's speech was one of the highlights of the celebration, reverberating with an emotion that only truth can bring. Sarah and Alex, now married, were a constant reminder that vulnerability could lead to the deepest of connections. At Horizon Tech, Eleanor's situation changed drastically. David Chen, impressed by her transformation and the way she handled the public exposure of her book, reconsidered the relocation. Instead, he offered her the coveted leadership position in data analysis. Eleanor accepted, but with a new perspective. She didn't seek control, but collaboration. She led her team with a blend of analytical expertise and a newfound empathy. She encouraged her colleagues to take risks, to speak up, to learn from mistakes, lessons she herself had learned the hard way. Her story inspired many in the company to confront their own fears and embrace growth. Her writing, once a closely guarded secret, became an integral part of her identity. Eleanor continued to write, exploring new ideas and themes, and her second book was already in the planning stages. Success brought visibility, and with it, the inevitable criticism. But Eleanor had learned to differentiate constructive judgment from the noise of fear. Eleanor did not become a fearless person. Fear still knocked at her door, especially when it came to new opportunities or exposing herself in new ways. However, the difference was that now she had the tools and the courage to open the door, look fear in the eye and say, "You can come with me, but you're not in control." She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but rather the ability to act despite it. She was no longer the prisoner in her tower of security. She was a woman who had built a bridge over the abyss of fear. And now, she was free to explore the vast and uncertain world that had always awaited her. Eleanor Vance's story was proof that by confronting our greatest fears, we can not only free ourselves but also inspire others to find their own courage. Years later, Eleanor Vance watched the sunset from her window. No longer from the isolated apartment, but from a vibrant home, filled with laughter and the warmth of friends. Her books were stacked on shelves, now visible and proud, echoes of The Undaunted and its sequels adorning the bookcase. She continued to write and inspire. Her career at Horizon Tech thrived, not out of unbridled ambition, but from a genuine desire to collaborate and lead with empathy. Fear, once a jailer, had become a mere distant whisper, a reminder of her journey. She was Eleanor, the author of her own life, fearless and free. Eleanor Vance's story invites us to a profound reflection. What fear is preventing you from living fully? What wall have you built that now traps you? Eleanor's journey shows that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. If you identified with this struggle, know that freedom is possible. Seek help, trust yourself, and dare to take the first step. And if this story inspired you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more stories of overcoming, and share your own experiences with fear in the comments. Your voice matters.